Well, hey everyone, Andy Serwich here with Hornet Security, and I've got Paul Schnackenberg with us for this video as well. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Andy?
Doing good, doing good. Well, Paul, I think it was what, a week and a half ago that we did our webinar on Windows Server 2022, right? So,
Yep, that's right.
and as usual with a lot of our webinars, we had a lot of great questions, and unfortunately, we don't always get through the entire question list, right? And we found that, especially in the past with like other Windows Server releases, we found that this is especially true with Windows Server focused webinars because there's just so much interest and so many questions. So what we're doing with this video is we're going to go through many of the questions that we basically didn't get to during the webinar to make sure that if you ask a question you didn't get an answer for during the webinar, you're getting it now. So that's the purpose of this video. So with that, I think, Paul, we'll just kind of go right down the list. What do you think?
Yeah, let's get started. No problem.
All right. So the first question that we've got here is, what is Azure edition of Windows Server 2022, basically, right? And how can I purchase it? I'm seeing data center and standard only. So yeah, from a purchasing perspective, traditionally how you would buy Windows Server licensing, you're still only going to see standard and data center, right? Whereas Azure Edition is designed to run in either Microsoft Azure, and when you deploy new workloads inside of Azure, you'll see Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition as an option. You can, however, run Azure Edition on premises with Azure Stack HCI. The one question mark still is, how are people getting that? Still kind of waiting to figure out how to officially get it on premises. So as soon as we have information on that, we'll probably do a blog post or something like that just to show people how that is done. The next question we have here is, now does one CPU with 10 cores mean 20 threads per license? So
Yep.
I think what they're getting at here is the licensing for Azure Stack HCI. I think that's what they're getting at with this question here.
No,
No?
I think this is Windows Server Essentials.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah, so Server 2022 comes in 3 editions, right? You got your standard, your data, well, 4 editions: standard, data center, and the Azure edition that we talked about. But then we also have this Essentials. Now, Essentials is you get it through your OEM, so you go and buy physically an Essential server. That machine can have a single CPU that can have up to 10 cores. I could not find an official statement whether that is hyper-threaded cores or not, but looking at all their other licensing, it seems that they don't care about hyper-threading. So I suspect if you can find a single CPU with 10 physical cores and you turn on hyper-threading, you'll still be right. So I think that should be okay there, because it's how Microsoft counts physical cores for SQL and Windows Standard
Right.
licensing server as well. Now, I do want to mention here, while we're on the Essentials topic, remember this is not a real essential. So if you've ever dealt with SMB IT, the back in 2012 R2 and 2016, there was a special version of Windows Server that had consoles and backup features for client machines and wizards for connecting to Office 365 and a whole heap of those sorts of features. None of that is around anymore, right? This Essentials in 2022 and 2019 is just a way of buying a slightly scaled down version of Windows Server to run in a small business, and it doesn't require any CALs. So you can have up to 25 users and 50 devices in your business, and you don't need to buy CALs for those users.
Gotcha. I got to say, I've been working with Azure Stack HCI too much, so I see anything with core licensing, and I instantly think of Azure Stack HCI. So, which we did talk about the licensing mechanism for Azure Stack HCI in the webinar. Which, if you're watching this video, we'll make sure a link to the webinar is below this video. It might be above this video too if you're watching it on social, but somewhere around this video will be a link to the actual webinar. All right, so for the next question we have here, there was a point during the webinar where I was talking about alternatives to the free Hyper-V SKU that's called Hyper-V Server. As we know, that SKU is going away. It's going to continue to be supported for 8 years, but it's going away, right? So we were talking about some alternatives. We did have one attendee in the webinar talk about how you can use XCP and G instead of Hyper-V as an alternative. So for those that aren't aware, XCP-ng is actually a open source Zen type of hypervisor, basically, right? So if you're familiar with Zen Server, it's an open source version of that. I can't speak for it myself because I've never used it, but it does seem to be highly recommended from what I've seen in the community. So I don't know, Paul, if you have any experience with it, but
No.
I can't speak for it. I can't vouch for it, but it does seem to be an alternative you could at least check out and test, right?
Yeah, exactly.
With that, we've got a question here about TPM 2.0 and whether or not it is required to run Windows Server 2022. Paul, I'll let you take a crack at that one.
Yeah, no. So if you're buying a secure core server, which we covered extensively in the webinar, then you do need a TPM 2.0 chip. But since you're going to be buying that server from Lenovo or HP or whoever, they're going to sell you one with the TPM 2.0 chip in it anyway. But it is not listed as a requirement. So if you're just upgrading your server 2019s you got in your data centers or server 16s to server 2022 and they don't have a TPM chip in it, they will still run, right? It's a good idea to have it, obviously. It allows you to turn on more security features, but it is not a requirement.
Got it. Next one is a question that's focused around Azure Stack HCI. And the question is just, does my Azure Stack HCI cluster have to be kept online? And by online in this context, they're talking about able to reach the internet. And because of the way the licensing mechanism works with Azure Stack HCI, it does have to be able to talk to Azure, the public cloud infrastructure, once every 30 days at least. If you go beyond that, like my lab did when I was preparing for the webinar demos, it will start complaining and you will lose some functionality in that cluster. So yes, at least once every 30 days. The next one works around another essentials question. So this is right up your alley, Paul. Does it work with the RDS role?
Yes. So remote desktop session host is one of the available roles because essentials is really just standard.
Right.
So,
Yep.
Absolutely.
Good. Here's a question that we have to give a disappointing answer to this one. And I run into this question all the time talking to folks in the community, and it centers around CALs for Windows Server, right? And the question is, can I bring through my 2012 R2 user CAL licenses to Server 2022? Sadly, no. You have to buy CALs that match the version. So that good old CAL licensing, those are the licenses that everybody forgets about when they start upgrading licenses.
Exactly. So your client access licenses do have to match the version of the server, unfortunately.
Yep. Another essentials question for you here, Paul. What kind of virtualization rights do we get with Server Essentials?
So again, according to the official statement from Microsoft, you can run one VM on that Essentials host. And for those few small businesses that are absolutely allergic to Office 365 or any other cloud-based infrastructure, I haven't done it myself and I wouldn't do it, but I have seen people having an Essential server as a file server and as the authentication hub, and then having a single VM on top of that running Exchange server so that they can still keep email in-house. Again, it is not a recommended setup today, but if you really want to, you can run one VM on top of Hyper-V inside of that Essential server.
Yeah, there's still those organizations, whether it's compliance reason or like you said, they're just allergic to using cloud services. They got to have that on-prem Exchange server. I know that when M365 really started maturing, I dropped my Exchange server like a hot potato, man. I could not get rid of that thing fast enough. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, as somebody who supported businesses with small business server and thus Exchange server ever since version 2000, all the way through 2003, 2007, 2010, and now have clients still having a couple of 2013 servers left, but they're not small businesses. I can attest to the fact that as soon as you get rid of your Exchange server, the number of help desk tickets drop radically. That's just how it is, unfortunately.
It's funny how that works, right?
Yeah, it is.
All right, another good question here. and I saw a lot of these with 2019 as well. Is there an upgrade path for Server 2012 R2 to 2021? And sadly, there's no direct upgrade path, right? So, what do you think on that, Paul?
No. So again, couldn't find an official statement in the documentation, etc. But basically, Microsoft has always, or at least for the last few versions, supported Windows Server upgrades from the last two versions. So if you're on 16 and 19, you should be able to go to 2022. But you got to really think it through here, whether that is your best path forward. It obviously has a lot of depends on what their server is being used for and what roles it's doing, etc., etc. The age of the server, if you're not talking about a virtual machine, but a clean installation can definitely be more future proofing, I suppose you'd call that. And we still have the migration tools, which we'll actually talk about the next question. So if you have like a DHCP server running on server 16 or something, you can quite easily migrate that to a clean install. Now you've got a clean server 2022 with DHCP on it.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's the older IT guy in me, but if I'm going more than a single version, like I don't know. Doing multiple version in-place upgrades just feels icky to me, you know? So I always opt for the clean install myself. But like Paul said, your mileage may vary. It depends on your individual situation, right? All right. What do we got next here? So, as you talked about CLI tool for migration, it will be used in PowerShell as well, right? So server.
Go ahead, server role migration tools are all in PowerShell, and there's documentation online. I don't think they've received a lot of upgrades in Server 2022. They seem to just be there, apart from, as we mentioned in the webinar, the storage service migration, because that of course they're putting a lot of effort into, so migrating file servers. But for all the other roles, the tools are there. I've used them a couple of times. They work. They do what you need them to do, and it gives you a clean server installation. So
very good. Yeah, this next one, I remember seeing this during the webinar, and it's why so much RAM. So of course the attendee is referring to the fact that you can now run 48 terabytes of memory on a Windows server, right? And the question is, why so much RAM? Is it really possible to put that much RAM in a server today? And like you mentioned during the webinar, Paul, they only say this when they've actually tested it. So there is a server somewhere on Microsoft's campus that has 48 terabytes of memory in it, right? And Paul, it's mainly it's because of the SAP workloads that are in Azure. I'm sure it was one of the driving factors there. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah. Maybe big SQL servers or big database loads. Occasionally, you'll have people who have a really gigantic database, and they have thousands of people accessing that database. So what they essentially want to do is they want to load it into memory, so that when all those thousands of people are reading data from that database, they're getting it straight out of RAM rather than off disk or disk cache. That could be another scenario, but generally when we talk about really big, multi terabyte VMs in Azure, we're talking about SAP workloads. And I suppose the other thing you got to think about, like Server 2022 is released now, it will have support till 2031/2032, something like that. That's 10 years in the future. Who knows what kind of size VMs we will have, or physical hosts we'll have in that time. And remember, the 48 terabytes is the physical host. I haven't actually seen the figures for the virtual machines. It might be half of that, but we'll see what those figures are. But it's still a lot of memory.
Right. Yeah. Like you mentioned in the webinar, that 48 terabytes is like, for, like the 1% of us system admins, right? Most of us will never, ever have to worry about that, at least not anytime soon. Like you said, you never know what we're going to be running in 10 years, right?
Yep.
All right. Next question we have here is another TLS question. Any chance that TLS 1.3 will be backported to 2012 R2? So I know in the webinar you mentioned that you felt like there's a good chance that it'll be backported to 2016 and 2019. What are your thoughts on 2012 R2?
Yeah, look, I suspect I have not been able to find any official statement on any of this, but if I was Microsoft and I'm looking at security, I cannot imagine, as I said in the webinar, right, that the 16 and 19 are supported for years to come, right? And I cannot imagine that Microsoft is going to go, no, you're not going to get TLS 1.3. I suspect what they're doing is they're watching industry adoption, right? How quickly is TLS going to be adopted? Because this takes time, right? Like the standards body can put it out, but then the OS vendors have to upgrade, the browser vendors have to upgrade, and then everything else has to upgrade. And one of the big things, I suppose, so the differences between TLS 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2 are really sort of improvements in cipher suites and hardening against found vulnerabilities. 1.3 is a different beast. It adds a lot of new features, like server name indicator and the ability to hide your DNS browsing. And for instance, the Great Firewall of China blocks TLS 1.3 outright, right? So it's just not available because they can't track where you're going, right? And that's, of course, going to be for security vendors making network inspection gear. There's a lot of other question marks around that as well. So I think TLS 1.3 is going to take a little bit longer until it sort of gets widely adopted. Once Microsoft sees that, they're probably, as I said, definitely going to go to 16 and 19, possibly not going to go back to 12R2.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen over the years, they're always happy to heavily support the previous two versions, right? 3 is a little bit of a stretch, right? So I'm with you on that one. All right, the next couple, we've got a couple more questions here. The next couple center around SMB over Quick, which is one of the new features that's kind of gated behind the Azure edition of Windows Server 2022 right here. And the first one is just kind of like a speculation type question, right? Do we think that SMB over Quick will ever work with Azure AD joined devices in the future? Maybe, right?
Yeah, that's very much a maybe. I remember, even if you look at Azure Files today, just sharing files, there's a lot of reliance on Active Directory, because Active Directory gives you all the fundamentals of underlying SMB in many ways. So I'm not sure. We're going to have to see.
Yep. Now, this next one really, I don't know, it really kind of hits home that whole concept I talked about in the webinar about how there's a lot of angst about so many of these features being gated behind the Azure edition of 2022. And the asker of this question put it perfectly. Now, to get SMB over Quick, you have to buy new hardware that is Azure HCI compliant. You don't have to, but definitely if you want to be supportable, yes, you do. You have to pay per month for the core licensing for the Azure Stack HCI cluster, which $10 per core per month, physical core, as far as we know. And then you have to run a instance of Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition with the file server role to get SMB over Quick on premises. That's a lot.
That is a lot. That's a high threshold just to have your users not have to use a VPN. And the final thing that you need to do as well is that file server, the Azure Edition file server sitting in your Azure Stack HCI cluster, also has to be the file server, or multiple ones, obviously. You can't have it be like a gateway to other older file servers behind it and present them to your internet users over Quick. So this is very much, look, it's a cool feature, but I think it's kind of early. I suspect maybe 2, 3, 4 years down the track we will have a different conversation around this. But today, that's a very high bar, right?
It really is. Now, I mean, obviously, if you're going to go to the trouble of putting Azure Stack HCI in your data center, you're going to use it for other things other than this. I'm not sure I see anybody going through all of that just for this feature. No. But like you said, in a couple of years, we're probably going to be having a different conversation about this, right? So right now, I
think so too.
Yeah, right now it just is what it is. So
Yeah, exactly. And remember, SMB over Quick is in preview.
Yep.
Server 22 to 2022 is GA, but SMB over Quick is still in preview. So look, I think it's Microsoft is trying this out, see how it goes. If Quick gets to be a very widely adopted protocol, I can certainly see, as I said, in a few years we'll have a different conversation here. But yeah, that's how it is today.
Definitely. Well, and the final question I want to wrap up with here centers around resource requirements, right? So what are the system resources required for Windows Server 2022? And I think you got a list over there, right, Paul?
I do indeed. So according to the official documentation, it is as follows. You need a 64-bit CPU. You need 2 gigabytes of RAM in the server if you're going to use the desktop UI version. If you're only going to use server core, you can get away with half a gigabyte, and you need a 32 gigabyte disk space minimum. Now, anybody who's listening to this video knows that that's absolute claptrap. You're not going to be running 32 gigabyte disks for a Windows server. As soon as you install your first patch on that thing, it's going to run out of space, right? So, so you're going to want a lot more than that. You're probably going to want a bit more RAM than 2 gigabytes as well. But yeah, that's where we're at the moment. I do think we have one more question though, don't we? Yes. So
which one's that?
46.
Oh, that's right. I need to scroll down. There we go. Yeah. Yes, good call. Yeah, this is a good one. I'm glad you reminded me about this. So Storage Spaces Direct has been available in Windows Server 2019 Standard. So for 2022, did this really move to data center only? And it's the same as it was in 2019. Yep. You had storage spaces in Standard, right? Storage Spaces Direct, the hyper-converged deployment option where I'm using the in-chassis disk and I'm clustering across 2 or more nodes in a hyper-converged fashion, that's Storage Spaces Direct. That is only available in Windows Server Data Center Edition.
That's correct. And that has been like that since forever. So basically, storage spaces is available in Windows 10. Like if you have a few disks in your home PC, you can pull them together using storage spaces. But if you want to share them between the nodes in a cluster, then you're definitely looking at Data Center Edition. And again, congratulations to Microsoft managing to come up with 2 different features that are slightly related, but having almost the same name and confusing everybody. Like that's just fantastic.
So we're not gonna talk about Azure Stack Edge, Azure Stack HCI, and 3 different deployment mechanisms, 3 different use cases. I get it. Azure is a brand, definitely. I totally get it from a marketing perspective, but it doesn't, for those, especially for those that are just getting into the ecosystem and trying to wrap their heads around it, it definitely doesn't make things easy.
It does not. It does not. So.
All right.
Yep, that's Microsoft for you.
That's right. So, all right. Well, I think we're wrapped on that. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for coming and answering these questions. And all of you watching, if there is a question that you have as a follow-up question or any additional questions you want to ask, just feel free to use the questions form beneath this video, and we will be sure to get you an answer there as well. But other than that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you for a future video. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.